In 1887, on the wind-swept plains of Wyoming Territory, the four McAllister brothers faced a desperate truth. Their thriving cattle ranch needed women's hands and hearts to become a true home. Each brother, unknown to the others, secretly penned letters to the Matrimonial Gazette. Meanwhile, in Boston, the four Blackwood sisters stood at a crossroads after their parents' passing left them penniless and vulnerable. When Eleanor, the eldest, discovered 3 separate advertisements from the same ranch, she saw Providence's hand at work. 1 ranch, 4 brothers, 4 sisters, a chance to stay together. What the McAllisters didn't expect when that dusty stagecoach arrived was that their mail-order brides were bound by blood and a secret that could either forge a dynasty or destroy everything they'd built. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform of Willow Creek Station, casting long shadows as 4 men stood in varying states of discomfort, their boots scuffing against weathered planks that had witnessed countless arrivals and departures, but perhaps none quite as momentous as today's. And Jackson McAllister, the eldest at 32, checked his pocket watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes, his weathered face a mask of stoic determination that concealed the churning in his gut. For this wasn't just another supply run or cattle shipment, but the arrival of women who would determine the future of the McAllister ranch. And beside him, Matthew adjusted his collar and smoothed back his dark hair with a practiced motion, his easy smile belying the nervous energy that had him shifting his weight like a stallion before a race. As unlike his serious older brother, Matthew had embraced the mail-order bride scheme with a characteristic blend of amusement and curiosity, having selected his bride based on a single intriguing line in her description, "Possesses both beauty and a fearless spirit," which had made him chuckle appreciatively when he'd first read it, thinking the Wyoming Territory could use more fearless beauty and a lot less monotony. Slightly apart from his brothers stood Samuel, 26 and slender, with wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the sunlight as he thumbed through a small leather-bound volume of Wordsworth, though his eyes hadn't moved across the page for several minutes, his scholarly mind instead constructing elaborate scenarios of the impending awkwardness with the woman who had written of her love for literature and botanical illustration, wondering if she would be disappointed by the rugged reality of their ranch compared to the life she'd known back east. And finally there was Daniel, barely 20, the youngest McAllister who made no attempt to hide his boyish excitement, his freckled face animated as he scanned the horizon for dust clouds, signaling the stage's approach, having spent weeks preparing the small room adjacent to his own, filling it with wildflowers that were now wilting in the summer heat. His innocent enthusiasm, a stark contrast to his brother's more complicated emotions, for Daniel had chosen a bride who had simply described herself as kind-hearted and hopeful, qualities that resonated with his own nature. "Stage is running late," Jackson muttered, closing his watch with a decisive snap that made Daniel jump slightly. "Remember what we agreed. We're gentlemen first, ranchers second, no matter how they look or what they say." His tone carrying the weight of command that came from years of raising his brothers after their parents' deaths in a flash flood 8 years prior, leaving him with 3 younger brothers and a sprawling cattle ranch that demanded every ounce of his strength and determination. "Don't worry so much, Jack," Matthew replied with a wink. "I'll charm them all, so thoroughly they won't notice how lacking you are in that department," which earned him a scowl from Jackson and a nervous laugh from Samuel, who closed his book and adjusted his spectacles, adding softly, "I just hope they don't find us too provincial," the word hanging in the air like an indictment of their rough-hewn lives. "They'll love it here," Daniel interjected with unwavering optimism. "The mountains, the open sky, but his words died in his throat as the distant rumble of wheels and the cloud of dust announced the stagecoach's imminent arrival, and all 4 brothers straightened instinctively, brushing dust from their best shirts and standing shoulder to shoulder as the coach thundered into town, the driver calling out a greeting as he reined in the lathered horses. "Special delivery for the McAllister boys," bellowed the driver, a grizzled man named Thompson who'd been running this route for 20 years. "Prettiest cargo I've hauled in a decade," causing Matthew to grin and Jackson to shoot him a warning glance that said clearly this was no time for his usual antics. The coach door swung open and for a moment no one moved, the brothers collectively holding their breath until a gloved hand appeared, followed by a woman who emerged with deliberate grace, her posture straight as a fence post as she surveyed the dusty street with clear, assessing eyes that betrayed neither disappointment nor enthusiasm, just calm, measured evaluation. She was perhaps 28, with chestnut hair pinned severely beneath a modest traveling hat, her traveling suit of deep blue wool impeccable despite the grueling journey, and Jackson felt a jolt of recognition. This had to be Eleanor Peterson, the practical widow he'd read about in the Matrimonial Gazette, though he hadn't actually sent for her yet. His letter still unfinished on his desk back at the ranch. Before he could process this confusion, a second woman appeared, practically vaulting from the coach with athletic ease, her green eyes flashing with a challenging gleam as she tossed her head, causing a rebellious auburn curl to escape her hat, and she stretched languidly like a cat after a long confinement, clearly relieved to be free of the coach's confines, her traveling dress of deep green the same shade as her eyes, which now swept over the four brothers with undisguised curiosity and perhaps a hint of amusement at their stunned expressions. Matthew felt his practiced smile falter, then broaden with genuine interest. This had to be Victoria James, the woman, with the fearless spirit he'd chosen. A soft clearing of a throat announced the third woman, who descended with tentative movements, a leather portfolio clutched protectively against her chest, her delicate features framed by soft brown waves that escaped her simple bonnet, and her eyes, when she raised them briefly, were the color of warm honey, quickly lowering again as she took in the rough-hewn town with what might have been dismay or simply shyness, causing Samuel to step forward unconsciously before catching himself. And finally, the fourth and youngest emerged, a girl of perhaps 18 with an open, heart-shaped face and eyes wide with unconcealed wonder as she gazed around at the mountains in the distance, the simple wooden buildings, and the brothers themselves, her natural enthusiasm so evident and unguarded that Daniel felt his own heart give a hopeful lurch. The four women stood together before the four brothers, and despite their different expressions and demeanors, the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same finely drawn features, the same graceful bearing, the same rich chestnut hair in varying shades from copper to deep brown. "Well, I'll be," Thompson chuckled from his perch, "like a matching set of fine china, all addressed to the McAllister spread." And Jackson's mind raced furiously, for this was certainly not what he'd planned, not what any of them had planned, and he stepped forward, hat in hand, addressing the eldest woman directly. "Ma'am, there seems to be some confusion. We were expecting 3 ladies, arriving separately." To which the woman named Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly, her voice clear and composed, though tinged with exhaustion when she spoke. "There is no confusion, Mr. McAllister. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and these are my sisters, Victoria, Charlotte, and Josephine," gesturing to each in turn before continuing. "You are Jackson, Matthew, Samuel, and Daniel McAllister. You each advertised for a bride, and we are the women who answered." Her direct approach, leaving no room for argument, though countless questions hung in the air. The wind kicked up, sending dust swirling around their feet as the brothers exchanged bewildered glances, and Daniel leaned closer to Samuel, whispering, "They're sisters," with undisguised delight, while Matthew seemed thoroughly amused by this unexpected turn of events. Jackson found his voice first. "I didn't actually send," he began, but Eleanor cut him off with a subtle shake of her head. The Matrimonial Gazette listed 4 brothers at the McAllister Ranch seeking wives. When we saw the advertisements, we recognized a singular opportunity to remain together as a family, and the unspoken desperation in her words was clear. These weren't just 4 independent women seeking husbands, but a family unit determined to stay intact. Thompson broke the awkward silence by dropping a trunk from the roof. "Got 6 more like this one, McAllister. Where do you want 'em?" Which forced Jackson back to practicalities. "Load them in our wagon," he directed before turning back to the women, seeing now the exhaustion beneath Eleanor's composure, the anxiety behind Victoria's boldness, the fear behind Charlotte's shyness, and the vulnerable hope in young Josephine's eyes. "Ladies," he said finally, his tone softer, "welcome to Willow Creek. Our ranch is 10 miles north, not much to look at yet, but it's home," which prompted Daniel to add enthusiastically, "and we've prepared rooms for all of you." earning him a grateful smile from Josephine that transformed her face like sunshine breaking through clouds. The journey to the ranch passed in strained silence, punctuated by Daniel's earnest attempts at conversation and Matthew's occasional charming observations about the landscape, while Samuel rode alongside quietly, stealing glances at Charlotte, who still clutched her portfolio as if it contained all her worldly treasures, and Jackson drove the wagon with Eleanor beside him, neither speaking yet both acutely aware of the momentous decision that had brought them to this point. As they crested the final hill, the McAllister Ranch came into view, a sprawling main house of sturdy logs with a wide porch, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and pastures dotted with cattle stretching toward distant mountains, all bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. "It's beautiful," breathed Josephine, the first word she'd spoken directly, causing Daniel to beam with pride while Victoria assessed the property with a calculating eye. Charlotte sketched the scene hastily in her portfolio, and Eleanor simply nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. By the time they reached the house, the awkwardness had crystallized into a tense awareness of the unusual situation they all found themselves in. 4 brothers and 4 sisters, strangers bound by letters and advertisements, now facing a shared future none of them had anticipated. Martha, the gruff older woman who cooked and kept house for the brothers, had prepared a welcome dinner that steamed on the long oak table as they entered, her suspicious gaze softening somewhat at the sight of the obviously exhausted women, and she showed them to their rooms with brisk efficiency, giving them barely enough time to wash away the travel dust before dinner was served. The meal began in awkward silence, broken finally by Matthew, who raised his glass in a toast to new beginnings and pleasant surprises, his easy charm drawing a reluctant smile from Victoria, who nonetheless challenged him directly. "Is that what we are, Mr. McAllister? Pleasant surprises like packages in the mail?" causing his smile to falter momentarily before he recovered. "More like unexpected blessings, Miss Blackwood." A response that made her arch one elegant eyebrow skeptically. Charlotte and Samuel discovered a shared passion for Wordsworth when she quietly corrected his misquoted verse, leading to a hushed conversation about poetry that excluded everyone else, his normally reserved manner warming in the presence of someone who understood his intellectual pursuits. Josephine complimented the fresh bread with such genuine appreciation that Martha actually blushed, and Daniel eagerly explained how he had helped build the new stone oven, their easy conversation a stark contrast to the tension elsewhere at the table. But the real clash was between Jackson and Eleanor, the 2 eldest, both accustomed to leadership and responsibility, as he finally addressed the situation directly. "Miss Blackwood, while we're honored by your presence, I must point out that I never actually sent a letter to the Matrimonial Gazette," causing Eleanor to set down her fork deliberately, her composure never wavering as she responded. The advertisement clearly stated, "McAllister Brothers 4, seeking wives of good character and practical skills. Are you suggesting the advertisement was fraudulent, Mr. McAllister?" Which backed him into an uncomfortable corner. "My brothers placed advertisements," he clarified. "I was," considering it, unwilling to admit that his half-finished letter still sat in his desk drawer. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then you are not seeking a wife, Mr. McAllister?" Her direct question causing an uncomfortable silence to fall over the table as everyone awaited his answer. Jackson looked around at his brothers, at the women who had traveled so far, and finally back to Eleanor, whose composed exterior couldn't quite hide the desperation beneath. She had brought her sisters across the country on the promise of security and family, and now that promise hung by a thread. The McAllisters keep their word. "Miss Blackwood," he finally said, his voice gruff but firm. "The advertisement promised 4 husbands, and 4 you shall have, provided there's no objection from any party after a suitable acquaintance period." A declaration that caused visible relief to wash over all 4 sisters, though Eleanor simply nodded once. "That seems reasonable, Mr. McAllister. We ask only for the opportunity to prove ourselves useful, and for your word that we may remain together, whatever the outcome." And as the sun set completely over the Wyoming territory, casting the dining room in the warm glow of lamplight, the 4 brothers and 4 sisters regarded each other across the table, strangers still, yet bound by circumstances, hope, necessity, and perhaps the first fragile threads of connection that might, in time, grow into something stronger than the arrangements that had brought them together. The weeks that followed saw the Wyoming summer unfurl in a tapestry of golden light and endless sky, as the Blackwood sisters cautiously settled into the rhythm of ranch life, each finding her place in ways none of the McAllister brothers could have predicted. Most surprising of all was Victoria, who within days had abandoned her fine city dresses for practical riding clothes, and revealed an uncanny affinity for horses that left even Matthew speechless the morning he found her in the corral, gently but firmly training a spirited young mare everyone had declared unrideable, her copper hair gleaming in the dawn light as she spoke low, soothing words to the animal that responded to her touch with trembling acquiescence. "You've got magic in your hands," he'd said, leaning against the fence with genuine admiration, replacing his usual practiced charm, to which she'd responded without looking up. "Not magic, Mr. McAllister. Just respect. Something this beautiful creature has rarely been shown by men, the barb unmistakable yet softened by the half-smile she couldn't quite suppress. Charlotte, meanwhile, had discovered an abandoned patch behind the cookhouse where she began plotting a garden with Samuel's eager assistance, their heads bent together over hand-drawn plans as she explained the medicinal properties of various herbs and the possibility of growing vegetables that would supplement their winter stores, her usual shyness dissolving when she spoke of plants and growing things, revealing a depth of practical knowledge that impressed Samuel deeply. "You know more about botany than anyone I've ever met," he told her as they worked side by side, turning the hard-packed soil, his scholarly hands developing calluses alongside hers, to which she'd responded with a rare, full smile. "My father believed education should be practical as well as intellectual. I've studied formal botany, but I've also grown food since I was a child." The mention of her father, causing a momentary shadow to cross her face, before she quickly returned to explaining the difference between varieties of beans. Youngest Josephine had become Martha's shadow in the kitchen, her natural warmth and enthusiasm winning over even that gruff woman's suspicious heart as she learned to adapt her Boston baking skills to a wood-fired oven, creating breads and simple desserts that Daniel declared better than anything in Wyoming territory, his freckled face alight with undisguised admiration as he helped her knead dough or churn butter, their laughter often spilling from the kitchen windows across the ranch yard, causing even Jackson to pause in his work occasionally, remembering a lighter time before responsibility had settled so heavily on his shoulders. But it was Eleanor and Jackson whose developing relationship most surprised the household, for their initial clash of wills had gradually transformed into a grudging mutual respect as Eleanor proved herself not just capable but invaluable with the ranch accounts, discovering discrepancies that had cost them considerable money, and implementing an organizational system that brought clarity to their financial situation. "You have a mind for business," Jackson had acknowledged one evening as they sat at the dining table long after the others had retired, ledgers spread between them in the lamplight, to which Eleanor had replied simply, "My father was a businessman, Mr. McAllister," before quickly changing the subject, her eyes dropping to the accounts again, a gesture Jackson was beginning to recognize as her way of avoiding topics that ventured too close to her past. The truth was that all four sisters carefully sidestepped direct questions about Boston, offering vague responses that satisfied casual curiosity but revealed almost nothing of substance, a pattern Jackson had noted with increasing concern, suspecting that whatever had driven them west involved more than the typical desire for a fresh start that brought so many to the frontier. The evidence of their refinement was clear in 100 small ways. In Charlotte's extensive education, in Victoria's knowledge of classical writing techniques rather than the practical Western style, in Josephine's understanding of social graces far beyond what would be expected in their current circumstances, and most tellingly, in Eleanor's business acumen and the way she carried herself with the assured dignity of someone raised in wealth and privilege. They were not the typical mail-order brides seeking escape from poverty or limited prospects, but women who had known a very different life, now adapting to circumstances that must represent a dramatic descent from their previous station. And Jackson found himself increasingly drawn to the mystery of Eleanor Blackwood, watching her when she thought herself unobserved, the way her composed expression sometimes slipped when she gazed toward the eastern horizon, revealing a fleeting vulnerability that stirred something protective in him despite his determination to maintain proper distance. It was on a particularly fine morning in late August when their fragile peace was shattered, beginning innocently enough when Matthew returned from town with supplies and the latest mail, his expression uncharacteristically serious as he sought out Jackson by the barn. "There's a stranger in town," he reported in a low voice, glancing toward the house to ensure they weren't overheard. "Eastern fellow, expensive suit." Asking questions about 4 sisters who might have come through on the stage, causing Jackson's hands to still on the bridle he was repairing. "What kind of questions?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, though his mind was already racing ahead to potential troubles. And Matthew's response confirmed his worst suspicions. Specific questions about 4 sisters named Blackwood, showing a photograph around, offering a reward for information, which explained why Matthew had ridden ahead of the supply wagon, wanting to warn his brother before news reached the house. "Who else knows?" Jackson demanded, to which Matthew replied grimly. "Thompson took his money, told him everything, that they're here, that they came as mail-order brides, the whole story." And Jackson cursed under his breath, knowing the stagecoach driver's loose tongue combined with coin would have ensured the information spread through town like wildfire. "This man, did he give a name? A reason?" He pressed and Matthew nodded. "Calls himself Harrington. Says he's a business associate of their father. Claims he's concerned for their welfare after a family tragedy. Got half the town sympathetic to his cause already." Which was exactly what Jackson had feared. A plausible story that would turn public opinion against harboring the sisters if this Harrington chose to make trouble. "He's staying at the hotel. Says he'll call on us tomorrow to ensure the young lady's well-being." Jackson, the way he said it, there was something beneath the politeness that didn't sit right, Matthew added, his usual levity entirely absent, and Jackson nodded grimly. "Get back to town. Find out everything you can about him without being obvious. I'll warn Eleanor," though the prospect of confronting her filled him with unease, knowing instinctively that this Harrington represented exactly the threat they had been hiding from. Jackson found Eleanor in the study, bent over the ledgers as usual, her face catching the afternoon light through the window in a way that momentarily distracted him from his purpose, highlighting the classical profile that could have graced a Roman coin, and he paused in the doorway, reluctant to shatter the peaceful moment with the troubling news he carried. She sensed his presence and looked up, a question forming in her eyes that died unspoken as she registered his expression. "What's happened?" she asked directly, setting down her pen with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. And Jackson closed the door before answering. "A man named Harrington is in town, asking about 4 sisters from Boston, showing photographs, and the effect of his words was immediate and devastating. All color drained from Eleanor's face as she gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white with tension, her carefully maintained composure cracking like ice in spring thaw. "He's found us," she whispered, more to herself than to Jackson, rising unsteadily to her feet. "We have to leave. Tonight, before he comes." Moving toward the door with single-minded purpose only to find Jackson blocking her way, his expression grave but determined. "Running again won't solve this. Eleanor, who is he?" But she attempted to step around him, panic evident in her usually controlled movements. "You don't understand. We need to go now. I have to warn my sisters." Her voice rising slightly before he caught her gently by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Eleanor, stop. I can't help you if you don't tell me the truth," his tone softening as he added, "Whatever it is, we'll face it together, but no more secrets. Not now." And something in his steady presence seemed to reach her through the panic, her breathing gradually slowing as she looked up at him with eyes swimming with unshed tears. "He'll destroy everything," she whispered, and Jackson shook his head firmly. "Not on McAllister land, he won't," the simple certainty in his voice offering a foundation when her world seemed to be collapsing. And slowly, reluctantly, she nodded once, returning to her chair as if her legs would no longer support her. "Get my sisters, please. They should hear this too," she requested quietly, and Jackson sent Daniel to gather the others, an unspoken urgency in his instructions that brought them all quickly to the study. Victoria immediately rushing to Eleanor's side when she saw her sister's distress, Charlotte clutching her ever-present portfolio like a shield, and Josephine's usual sunshine dimmed by evident fear as they arranged themselves around the room. The four McAllister brothers standing protectively nearby, as if physically representing the barrier they would form between the sisters and whatever threatened them. "His name is Richard Harrington," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "He was my father's business partner for 20 years, a man we welcomed into our home, who dined at our table, who watched us grow up." Her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling as she continued. 3 years ago, our mother died of influenza, and father changed, began taking risks with the business, making investments that Harrington encouraged despite their questionable nature. Her gaze fixed on the middle distance, as if seeing the events unfold again before her eyes. 6 months ago, father died suddenly. Heart failure, the doctor said. And we discovered the truth. The business was ruined, mortgaged to its foundations, with debts that would consume even our family home. Victoria's face hardened at these words, her hand finding Eleanor's in silent support as their shared pain filled the room. "Harrington came to us the day after the funeral," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "He said he could save us from scandal and poverty, that he would assume all debts and preserve our social standing, on one condition, that I marry him immediately," causing Jackson to stiffen visibly, his jaw clenching as he began to understand the full picture. When she refused, Victoria interjected, unable to remain silent. "He became different, showed his true nature, said he'd ensure we all ended in the poorhouse, or worse, that he had evidence father had committed fraud and could have his name posthumously ruined, dragging all of us down with him," her green eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and fury at the memory. "I told him I needed time to consider for my sister's sake," Eleanor resumed, "and he gave us 1 week, during which we discovered he had systematically destroyed father's business himself, manipulating investments, forging documents. Charlotte found the evidence hidden in father's study, papers that suggested father might have begun to suspect him shortly before his death. And Charlotte nodded confirmation, opening her portfolio to reveal not just botanical sketches but carefully preserved documents hidden between the pages. "I don't think father's heart failed naturally," she said softly, the implication hanging heavy in the room. "We couldn't prove anything against someone of his standing," Eleanor explained. "But we had enough evidence that he couldn't risk us taking it public. It became a stalemate, with our reputation against his, until we saw the advertisements in the Matrimonial Gazette, 4 brothers seeking wives, and it seemed like Providence offering an escape." Her gaze finally rising to meet Jackson's, silently pleading for understanding. "So you ran," Samuel said gently. "Took what evidence you had and fled across the country." And Josephine nodded, adding with unexpected conviction, "We had to stay together. Eleanor protected all of us, refused his offer even though accepting would have saved her from ruin. We couldn't leave her to face him alone," her young face showing a maturity beyond her years in that moment. "And now he's found us," Eleanor concluded, her composure finally returning though her eyes still held the shadow of fear. "He won't stop, Mr. McAllister. He wants me, wants to punish me for refusing him, and he'll use my sisters as leverage if he can. The evidence against him is the only protection we have, but it won't be enough if he can turn public opinion against us as runaway wards or hysterical females inventing tales against a respected businessman." The bleak assessment hanging in the air until Jackson finally broke the silence, moving to stand before her, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time, his voice low and intense. "On my land, under my roof. You and your sisters are under McAllister protection, all 4 of you," his gaze sweeping to include his brothers who nodded firm agreement. "This Harrington may have had power in Boston, but Wyoming plays by different rules." The simple statement containing a steel promise that caused Eleanor to look up at him with the first glimmer of hope she'd allowed herself in months. "He'll come tomorrow," she whispered, and Jackson nodded once. His decision already made, though he hadn't yet shared it with anyone, not even his brothers. "Let him come." The McAllisters will be ready. Dawn broke over the McAllister ranch with an ominous crimson glow that painted the mountains blood red, a fitting harbinger for the day ahead as the household stirred with tense purpose, breakfast eaten in uncharacteristic silence while final preparations were made. Charlotte's documents arranged carefully on Jackson's desk. Samuel having spent half the night making copies to be sent to the territorial judge should anything go awry. Victoria and Matthew had ridden out at first light to alert neighboring ranchers of potential trouble, ensuring witnesses would be nearby if Harrington attempted anything beyond legal means, their shared concern for their siblings temporarily overriding the spirited clashes that typically characterize their interactions. Josephine and Daniel worked together to prepare food and water, their usual light-hearted banter subdued by the gravity of the situation, yet finding comfort in shared tasks and occasional reassuring touches that needed no words. And at the center of it all were Jackson and Eleanor, their natural leadership merging seamlessly as they finalized their strategy. Standing shoulder to shoulder at the study window as the sound of approaching horses reached them from the long drive. Eleanor's hand instinctively reaching for Jackson's arm, finding it solid and steady beneath her trembling fingers. "Remember," he said quietly, for her ears alone, "whatever happens, we face it together." The simple statement containing layers of meaning that caused her to look up at him with sudden clarity, seeing not just the steadfast rancher who had reluctantly accepted her into his home, but a man who had, without either of them fully realizing it, become essential to her world. The riders appeared around the bend in the drive, 5 men on horseback, 4 rough-looking hired guns flanking a distinguished figure whose expensive Eastern suit and imperious bearing marked him immediately as Richard Harrington, his silver-streaked dark hair, and meticulously trimmed beard-framing features that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes as he surveyed the ranch house. All 4 McAllister brothers stood on the front porch as the party approached, a united front with rifles visible but not raised, their expressions grim yet controlled as Eleanor and her sisters emerged from the house to stand behind them, Victoria's hand resting near the small derringer concealed in her skirts, Charlotte clutching her precious portfolio, Josephine's usual sunshine dimmed but not extinguished as she stood tall despite her fear. "Mr. Harrington," Jackson called as the riders halted in the yard, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man on his own land. "I understand you've been asking after the Blackwood sisters in town, deliberately using their real name to make clear they had no secrets to exploit here." Harrington's surprise at this direct approach flickered briefly across his face before his practiced smile emerged, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his age. "Mr. McAllister, I presume?" "Indeed, I've been deeply concerned about these young ladies since their unfortunate departure from Boston, following their dear father's death." His cultured voice dripping with false concern as his gaze fixed predatorily on Eleanor. "As their father's business partner and executor of his estate, I have a responsibility to ensure their welfare and return them to their proper place in society." The implied ownership in his tone causing Jackson's jaw to tighten visibly. "The Blackwood sisters are here as invited guests and potential brides," Jackson replied evenly. "Their proper place is wherever they choose it to be." Which drew a cold laugh from Harrington, who gestured to his men to spread out around the yard. A not-so-subtle demonstration of force. "How charmingly provincial," Harrington remarked with patronizing amusement. "But these women are not mail-order brides, Mr. McAllister. They are daughters of one of Boston's finest families, temporarily confused by grief and misguided by their eldest sister's unfortunate, romantic notions." His gaze sliding to Eleanor with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl despite the summer heat. "We are quite aware of who the Blackwood sisters are," Jackson countered, surprising Harrington again, "including the circumstances of their father's business failure and death, and your role in both." The direct accusation hanging in the air like gunsmoke, as Eleanor stepped forward to stand beside Jackson rather than behind him, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We have evidence of your embezzlement, Richard," she stated clearly, drawing strength from Jackson's solid presence beside her. "Forged documents, manipulated accounts, proof that you systematically destroyed my father's business while encouraging him to make investments you knew would fail," causing Harrington's carefully composed expression to falter pistis, momentarily before he recovered with a dismissive wave. "My dear Eleanor, grief has clearly affected your judgment. Whatever papers you think incriminate me, are merely the desperate misinterpretations of a woman, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her understanding. His condescending tone designed to undermine her credibility, a tactic that had served him well in Boston society. But Wyoming was not Boston, and Jackson's next words made that distinction perfectly clear. Those papers have been reviewed by Samuel, who studied law at Harvard before coming west, and copies have been sent to Judge Harrison in Cheyenne as well as the territorial governor. A strategic embellishment that Samuel supported with a confident nod, adjusting his spectacles with scholarly precision. Furthermore, Jackson continued, gesturing to the ridge where several neighboring ranchers could now be seen watching the proceedings, Matthew's mission having borne fruit. Witnesses have been arranged, should any unfortunate accidents befall anyone at this ranch. The implied threat unmistakable as Harrington's hired guns shifted uneasily, clearly having expected an easy intimidation rather than a well-prepared defense. Harrington's facade of benevolent concern hardened into something uglier as he realized his position was weaker than anticipated. This changes nothing. These women have no legal protection here. No husbands, no formal contracts. Merely the flimsy premise of mail-order bride arrangements that were entered into fraudulently, his voice taking on a dangerous edge as he played what he believed was his strongest card. "You're mistaken on that count as well," Eleanor interjected with newfound confidence, exchanging a meaningful glance with Jackson that contained a question and received an almost imperceptible nod in response. "I am in fact betrothed to Mr. Jackson McAllister, with the wedding planned for next month," the declaration causing a ripple of surprise among both her sisters and the younger McAllister brothers, though none contradicted her. Harrington's laugh held no humor, only bitter disbelief. A convenient claim, easily disproven. Where is the documentation, the formal announcement? Even in this wilderness, certain proprieties must be observed. But before he could continue, Matthew stepped forward with his characteristic easy smile that didn't reach his suddenly dangerous eyes. "Actually, sir, all 4 Blackwood sisters are engaged to all 4 McAllister brothers. A rather poetic arrangement. Wouldn't you agree? And while we may lack formal announcements, we have witnesses aplenty to these intentions," gesturing to the watching ranchers and their own household staff who had emerged to observe the confrontation, Martha's weathered face particularly fierce in her protective stance near the door. Victoria moved to Matthew's side, her chin lifted in defiance as she added, "Unlike in Boston, a person's word still means something in Wyoming territory." While Samuel and Charlotte, then Daniel and Josephine formed similar pairs, the 8 of them presenting a unified front that even Harrington's hired guns seemed reluctant to challenge, exchanging uncertain glances. As the odds visibly shifted, Harrington's mask slipped completely then, revealing the cold rage beneath as he spat. "This charade changes nothing. Eleanor is mine by right, promised by her father before his death as settlement for debts that would otherwise fall to all of his daughters," the naked possessiveness in his voice confirming every fear Eleanor had harbored. "My father would never have promised me to you," Eleanor responded, trembling now with anger rather than fear. "Any more than he would have willingly destroyed his own business. Both were your doing, as was his conveniently timed death," the accusation hanging in the air like a thundercloud. Harrington's hand moved toward his coat but froze as 4 rifles instantly raised in response. Jackson's voice deadly quiet as he stated, "I wouldn't," a simple phrase that carried immeasurable threat. For a moment no one moved, the tableau frozen in the harsh sunlight until Charlotte unexpectedly broke the silence, stepping forward with her portfolio open to reveal a particular document. "This is my father's actual will, Mr. Harrington, not the altered version you presented in Boston. Note the provision specifically prohibiting any arranged marriages for his daughters without their explicit consent," her typically soft voice carrying surprising authority as she continued. "And this," turning to another document, "is the original partnership agreement showing your fiduciary responsibility, alongside father's personal journal documenting his growing suspicions about your management of company funds, the evidence she had protected so carefully, now becoming their strongest weapon." Harrington's hired guns began backing their horses away, clearly reassessing the wisdom of their employment as one muttered, "You didn't say nothing about murder and document fraud. Harrington, that's hangin' business in the territory. while the neighboring ranchers began moving closer, drawn by the tension visible even. From a distance, cornered and suddenly alone, Harrington made one final desperate attempt, addressing Eleanor directly with venomous intensity. "You'll regret this defiance. Without me, you're nothing. No position in society, no future beyond this primitive existence with these laborers." But his words fell flat against the solid wall of resolve before him, and Eleanor's response was devastating in its simplicity. "I've found something here worth more than everything you offered. Richard. Freedom, purpose, and people who stand beside me rather than seeking to own me." Her hand finding Jackson's as she spoke. "You have until sundown to leave Willow Creek," Jackson stated with the unmistakable authority of a man protecting what was his. "After that, we'll be presenting Charlotte's evidence to the sheriff with formal charges of fraud, embezzlement, and suspicion of murder." The ultimatum leaving no room for negotiation, as Harrington stared at the united front before him, calculating his options and finding them severely limited. With a final venomous glare that promised this wasn't truly over, he mounted his horse and spurred it viciously, riding away with what little dignity he could muster while his hired guns scattered in different directions, unwilling to be associated with what had clearly become a losing proposition. As the dust settled in the yard, the tension held for one breathless moment before breaking like a fever. Josephine's joyful sob the first sound as Daniel wrapped her in a protective embrace, Charlotte sagging with relief against Samuel's steadying arm, Victoria and Matthew exchanging a look of shared triumph that transformed into something deeper before either could mask it. But Jackson and Eleanor remained still, their hands still joined, the weight of everything unspoken between them suddenly too important to be rushed or misunderstood. The following days passed in a curious mixture of wariness and celebration. The ranch, returning to its rhythms while keeping vigilant watch for Harrington's possible return, though word eventually reached them that he had boarded an eastbound train, presumably to attempt damage control in Boston before Charlotte's evidence could reach authorities there. It was during this time of transition that the true transformation of their arranged circumstances into something genuine began to crystallize, starting with Jackson and Eleanor, who found themselves alone in the study one evening, as sunset painted the room in amber light, ledgers forgotten on the desk between them as he finally asked the question that had been building since the confrontation. "Did you mean it? About being betrothed?" His usually confident voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Eleanor met his gaze directly, her composure softened by the gentle light. "It was tactical, of course," she began, causing his expression to shudder slightly before she continued. "But tactics can reveal truths we haven't admitted even to ourselves," her hand reaching hesitantly across the desk to touch his. "When I came here, I was seeking safety. Nothing more. I never expected to find a man whose strength would complement my own rather than attempt to diminish it." The simple honesty in her words more powerful than any practiced declaration could have been. Jackson turned her hand over in his calloused fingers, tracing the delicate lines of her palm as he replied, "I didn't want a wife. I thought I needed only a practical arrangement for the ranch's sake." A smile softening his weathered features as he added, "Instead, I found a woman I can't imagine living without, whose courage and intelligence challenge me to be better than I am," rising to move around the desk and kneel before her, still holding her hand. "Eleanor Blackwood, will you make our tactical deception a truth? Will you build a life with me here, not because of threats or arrangements, but because this is where we both belong, together?" The question hanging between them for only a heartbeat before her whispered, "Yes," sealed the promise with a kiss that held all the tenderness their initial meeting had lacked. Matthew and Victoria's moment came at sunset 3 days later as they raced their horses along the ridge overlooking the ranch, her copper hair streaming behind her like flame against the pink-gold sky as she pushed her mount to match his stride for stride. Their competitive spirits perfectly matched until they simultaneously reined in at the highest point, breathless and laughing as they dismounted to watch the sun sink behind the mountains. "You ride like you were born to it," Matthew observed, genuine admiration replacing his usual practiced compliments. "As if you and that mare share one mind," causing Victoria to smile with uncomplicated pleasure at the recognition of a skill she valued. "In Boston, I was considered scandalously unfeminine for my love of riding," she admitted, watching the fading light paint the landscape in impossible colors. "My father indulged me, But society expected different qualities in a potential wife. Her usual defiance softened by the memory of her father's support. Matthew moved closer, his characteristic confidence tempered by unusual sincerity. In case you haven't noticed, Wyoming has different expectations. His hand tentatively finding hers as he continued. Out here, a woman's strength is as valuable as her beauty, her spirit as important as her manners. Turning to face her fully, the setting sun igniting gold flecks in his eyes, as he added, "When you came off that stagecoach, I thought I'd found a woman with lively wit. I had no idea I'd found my match in every way that matters." Dropping to one knee despite the rocky ground, still holding her hand. "Victoria Blackwood, will you marry me? Not because of arrangements or threats, but because together we could outride, outlast, and outlive anything this territory throws at us." Her joyful acceptance sealed with a kiss as fiery and passionate as both their natures. For Samuel and Charlotte, their moment blossomed naturally in the garden they had created together, now flourishing with late summer abundance as they harvested herbs for drying. Their quiet companionship deepened by shared intellectual curiosity and mutual respect. "These will help keep everyone healthy through winter," Charlotte observed, carefully tying lavender into bundles, her portfolio nearby containing detailed drawings of each plant with notes on their properties. "Though I hope to expand next spring with more medicinal varieties." The casual mention of a future here causing Samuel to look at her with sudden intensity. "You truly plan to stay?" he asked softly, adjusting his spectacles in a gesture she had come to find endearing. And she nodded, color rising in her cheeks as she admitted, "I've found peace here I never expected. Room to grow things, to draw, to think without constant social demands." Her gaze lifting to his with unusual directness. "And someone who values knowledge for its own sake, not as a social accomplishment." The admission drawing him closer until they knelt face to face among the plants they had nurtured together. "Charlotte Blackwood," Samuel began, his scholarly demeanor infused with gentle passion. "I've spent my life among books searching for beauty and truth, never realizing they could be embodied in one person. You see the world as poetry. Find meaning in the growth of a seed. Turn science into art." Reaching for her hand among the herbs. "Will you marry me, Charlotte? Will you build a life of knowledge and beauty with me, filling our home with books and plants and perhaps, someday, children who will learn from your wisdom?" Her whispered, "Yes," barely audible but absolutely certain as he gathered her gently in his arms. Daniel and Josephine completed the circle as they prepared a celebration feast together in the kitchen, flour dusting her cheeks as she taught him to make her special apple tarts, their easy laughter and synchronous movements speaking of a compatibility that needed little explanation. "You've brought sunshine into this house, Jenny," Daniel said suddenly, using the nickname that had become his alone to use. "Before you came, it was just a place where we ate and slept between work. Now it's truly a home." The simple observation containing profound truth that made her pause in her rolling of dough. "And you've given me safety without confinement, Daniel," she responded with equal sincerity, her young face wise beyond its years in that moment. "I was so afraid when we came here, but you never once made me feel trapped or obligated." Her flour-dusted hand reaching to touch his freckled cheek with gentle affection. Daniel covered her hand with his own, his expression earnest and open as always. "I picked a kind-hearted and hopeful bride from a catalog, Jenny, but I found someone whose goodness makes me want to be worthy of her every day." Dropping to one knee on the kitchen floor despite the flour and chaos around them. "Josephine Blackwood, will you marry me? Will you keep making this house a home, filling it with your laughter and kindness for all the years to come?" Her joyful acceptance punctuated by a shower of flour as she threw her arms around his neck, sealing their promise with sweet-tasting kisses. And so it was that 1 year later, as summer again painted the Wyoming landscape in gold, the expanded McAllister Ranch house stood as testament to the extraordinary transformation that had occurred. 4 couples gathered on the wide porch at sunset, watching the alpenglow touch the distant mountains with rose and amber light. Eleanor stood within the circle of Jackson's arm, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly as she announced with quiet joy, The first McAllister of the next generation will arrive by Christmas, causing celebratory exclamations from the others. Victoria and Matthew's loud enthusiasm, Charlotte and Samuel's quiet delight, Josephine and Daniel's exclamations of pure happiness. As Jackson pressed a reverent kiss to his wife's temple, the narrator's voice seemed to rise on the evening breeze, reflecting on how an arrangement born of desperation had transformed into a dynasty built on love, courage, and family bonds, how 4 brothers and 4 sisters, strangers bound by circumstance, had found in each other not just safety or convenience, but the other halves of themselves, forging a legacy that would endure through generations in the Wyoming Territory, proving that sometimes the most unexpected arrivals lead to the most extraordinary destinations, and that love, when given room to grow naturally, can transform the simplest mail-order arrangement into the most profound of lifetime commitments.